Hello again. Being Black History Month in February, I want to bring some attention to some people involved in the Seminole history in Florida and beyond. Uh, People who have not gotten much attention in the past. And so the first thing I found in the Wichita Eagle newspaper November 19th, 1899, I found the story of Aunt Betsy Payne, who was a witness to the Second Seminole War, who moved to Fort Clark, Texas. And so let's begin. Fort Clark, Texas, interesting story, if I can. And today it's near Brackettsville in southwest Texas. It was a frontier fort between the United States and Mexico. And in about 1849, Kawakachi, one of the famous Seminole warrior chiefs, took about 200 people with him down to Mexico to escape the persecution that was going on in Indian Territory. He took with him a significant number of black Seminole people and their families who were being hounded by the slave hunters in Indian Territory, and they just wanted freedom. So they lived down there for a few decades. Kawakachi died about 1857, I believe, of tuberculosis, maybe. Um, anyway, after the Civil War, the federal government went down and recruited them back into the United States, said that they would make them soldiers with the cavalry and pay them and offer them land. So many of them turned, I guess, became the 25th Infantry and also like the Ninth and 10th Cavalry that were the Buffalo Soldiers. They were at Fort Clark and Fort Davis. If you ever go to Fort Davis, that's an interesting place too. And so this Fort Clark during the cavalry days of the late 1800s. Out in the Texas plain. Fort Davis and Fort Clark are very similar. Oh, and I'm up in Tallahassee, and nearby is Thomasville. And buried in Thomasville is Lieutenant Flipper, who was the first black officer, graduated from West Point, and he was cashiered and brought up on false charges. They had stolen money and kicked out of the army, but he returned to his hometown in Thomasville, Georgia, and is buried there. And they have a neat exhibit about him. He became a successful businessman in Thomasville, and you can go to the museum and the Thomas County Museum in Thomasville, Georgia. So anyway, this is the Cavalry Post, and of course the uh, Black Seminoles, as they became known, were recruited and became cavalry soldiers. Here's the old commissary barracks in Fort Clark, Texas, that you can visit today. It's not only a historic site, but it's also a resort. And many of the people were said to have made uh, huts and shelters similar to what they had in Florida and Mexico. As you can see here from this picture, there's, like it looked like a wooden cabin, almost looks like a wood chimney. Uh, and they did wattle and daub houses and were Buffalo soldiers for many years. They had a very hard life on that. Now, as the military was, they were very successful. Several of them got Medal of Honor for their actions. None of them were lost in combat, I believe, from what I read a few years ago. Uh, but life on the Fort Clark was not so good. There's a newspaper report in 1905 basically saying the government has abandoned them and they're starving and they're living in very destitute condition. So they were not given everything that they were promised by the government, which should be no surprise. And if you visit Fort Clark today, this is the stone barracks. I believe this was built in the 1930s to look like the older cavalry barracks, but you could actually stay in the barracks. They've turned into like a barracks building into a guest house. So here's the newspaper article I have, and it's very interesting. And I'll make some comments maybe as I go along. One Seminole War survivor, aged negress in Texas who saw the struggle in the Everglades. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Territory, November 18th. Of course, this is before Oklahoma became a state. The death of any aged Indian takes from Indian history some of its romantic details and puts them beyond recovery, for they are not written down nor printed. In this connection, it will be interesting to know that there has been discovered recently at Fort Clark in western Texas a woman known as Aunt Betsy Payne, Payne, who lives with a small detached remnant of the Seminoles in that vicinity. Aunt Betsy Payne believes she is over 100 years old. So, of course, 1899, she was born in the late 1700s, probably 1790s. Her extraordinary memory of important historical events that she says she has witnessed and is able to describe with singular accuracy makes strong testimony in support of the opinion as to her age. She stoutly maintains that she has Seminole blood in her veins, though her color and features indicate that she is certainly a full-blooded African. And, that's kind of a biased and racist statement, who's to know just because of her sun-baked skin color. She evidently has lived with the Seminoles all her life, and she is regarded highly by the Indians because she is the widow of Chief Payne, a famous warrior. Uh, I'm, I don't think they're talking about King Payne. They may be talking about one of his sons because indication here is in this article is that he was living decades after King Payne died, but she's living in the same area. White people, especially the officers at the fort, treat old Aunt Betsy with much more than ordinary consideration because she is the mother of a race of soldiers. She's had seven sons in the Union Army, and for her descendants, 23 are now serving with the United States regulars. She possessed a picture cut from the St. Louis paper showing a group of 14 of her boys, as she calls them, wearing Uncle Sam's uniform and wrote to Cuba. So she had some of her sons or grandsons that participated in the Spanish-American War. Probably went up Kettle Hill with the Teddy Roosevelt in his command. That's several of them did. Aunt Betsy has lived about the frontier forts for more than half a century, and owing to her motherly attributes and her skill in cooking, she is favorably known to a great number of Army officers, many of whom have given to her little testimonies of their regard. She has a silver dollar given to her by General Phil Sheridan and a handkerchief that was presented to her by General Robert E. Lee. On the walls of her cabin, there are many pictures of Army officers whose names are familiar to every schoolboy. Aunt Betsy says that she has a grown girl when the trouble occurred between the United States and Spain over the invasion of Florida by General Jackson. So she's talking about the first Seminole War in 1818. Uh, okay, so she was a grown girl when the trouble occurred between the United States and Spain over the invasion of Florida by Andrew Jackson. If she was not alive at that time, she's certainly well informed as to the history of that particular period. Spain ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, and by the terms of the treaty made between the great powers, all runaway slaves were to be returned to their masters upon proof of ownership. Aunt Betsy says that one exception was made to this clause in favor of the Negro wives of the Seminole warriors. She distinctly remembers that King Payne told her all about this matter and asked her if she would not like to be his squaw, warning her at the time that the white soldiers might make lying papers and take her away unless she is consented to the arrangement that he had suggested. So it's definitely not King Payne, probably one of his sons. I'm sure if it was Micanopy, I'm sure they would have said Micanopy. She says that there was constant trouble between the Indians and the white settlers from the time until the Treaty of Paynes Landing, made May 9th, 1832. White men continued to encroach upon the lands of the Seminoles and had men committed crimes and charged such outrages against Indians. Negroes were daily fleeing from their masters on the plantations and seeking safe refuge in the Everglades behind the Seminole village. So, at this point, they consider the Everglades everything, I guess, south of south of I-10 in Florida. Wise old chiefs, among was her husband Payne, foresaw that war was inevitable, and those who had faced Jackson's riflemen on the battlefield had good reason to fear the results of such a conflict. The peace party argued that the whites were trying to provoke hostilities to that eager frontier settlers might find an excuse to exterminate the Indians and steal their lands. Therefore, Chief Payne and his followers were in favor of accepting the conditions offered by the United States commissioners and avoiding the dangerous war by moving to Indian Territory. The treaty was made. Okay. 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 Sorry. Lost my place here. I try to print out that I can read it. So anyway. uh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Aunt Betsy says that she saw the great chiefs and the white men signing the paper under a large tree in front of her husband's home, that she is sure that she was mother of four children at that time. That would be on the Paynes Landing on the Ocklawaha River. Um, so that's where she's at, and that's apparently where the village was at. She certainly must have witnessed this important event, for the facts that she state them in close accord are written history. Osceola, who was the most influential and picturesque among the younger leaders, positively refused to touch the paper as he withdrew in sullen silence to the shade of the tree near where Aunt Betsy sat nursing her baby. He was afterwards joined by Alligator, Micanopy, Jumper, and several other warriors who supported his sentiments. So, I mean, there's always a argument whether Osceola would have signed or not, but under Seminole hierarchy, he actually didn't have the authority because he was not a major chief. He was a war leader at that point. Who knows anything about this hunting ground under the setting sun that the white man says is so good? If it is such a fair land and so good, why doesn't the white man go and possess it and let the Seminoles alone in their land of warmth and sunshine? Said Osceola. Excellent point. We all know, said Jumper, that if it gets colder when the sun goes to sleep, the rivers are ice and the grass and trees cannot grow. There can be no hunting grounds in that dark land. The white man lies. He wants our country. We were here before he came. Let the white man go to that good land he tells the Seminoles so much about. I love his words here. As for Jumper, he was born here by the beautiful rivers, and here he will stay and die with his arms in his hands. Jumper, I believe, was Eufaula Indian. May have actually been born in Alabama, but hey, that's close enough. Aunt Betsy says they are young. chiefs talked in the same strain, uttering their sentiments in a low tone, and that after a short time they slowly withdrew from the crowd and disappeared in the forest. That night, Aunt Betsy told her husband that the treaty amounted to nothing and that the war was sure to come. Chief Payne said that if she were right in her conjecture, the Seminoles were doomed, for it was evident that the white men were determined to possess all Florida. There was a bare semblance of peace for the next 18 months, during which period many chiefs were kept in a friendly mood by the payment of small sums of money and great promises that were to be fulfilled as soon as the Senate ratified the treaty. So she's right there. It did take a long time for the Senate to actually ratify the treaty. The war party among the Seminole Indians increased in strength, and Osceola, supported by several other chiefs, continued to display obstinacy, making little effort to conceal hatred of the white people. Osceola's conduct finally so alarmed General Thompson, who was the Indian agent in Florida, that he ordered him arrested. After lying in chains for 6 days, Osceola affected to repent of his former rebellious attitude and declared himself ready to accept the conditions offered by the commissioners and became ally and friend of the whites for all time. And she's actually correct on that. I had to do a little research on how long they actually held Osceola, and it was about 6 days, from what I've been able to find in the Indian Affairs papers. Anyway, about Osceola, he outwitted his captors in diplomacy, for there is not a shadow of truth in his words, and revenge was the only sentiment that prevailed in his breast. He proved himself the Roman warrior of his tribe, thoroughly endued with unrelenting hatred towards the foes and scorning danger in every form. No chief was better fitted to avenge the wrongs that his people had suffered at the hands of his eager frontiersmen. Bloodhounds were used in the great Indian hunts, were carried on for 7 years in the Everglades of Florida. The Southern planters said that there were more runaway Negroes in the swamps than Indians. Well, that's an overstatement, I believe. Uh, Aunt Betsy proudly boasts that the Seminoles were the first abolitionists in America, and she thinks history should credit them with humanitarian ideas in advance of the white people of the North. That's a pretty bold statement, but I really like what she's saying here. It's obvious that even at 100 years old, her mind's very sharp. The greed for the land of the Seminoles and the desire of the Southern planters to destroy the refuge of runaway slaves involved the United States in a cruel and bloody war that lasted 7 years and cost the country $40 million and the lives of 1,446 soldiers and 1,500 settlers. Yeah, that's a footnote added, but that's actually correct too. Aunt Betty had stood on the field of battle, and she has hungered for weeks and marched through the Everglades with a child on her back, often within hearing of the baying of the fierce bloodhounds, in whose white fangs she knew there was no mercy. She had seen villages burned and children torn to shreds by dogs, and yet Aaron Fortune has left her in the old age, kissing the hand that smote her in the proud of her 23 descendants now fighting for the same flag that that flies over the ashes of her wigwams and the mangled bodies of her warrior husband 60 years ago. So her husband died in war. Doesn't say. I don't know. Wondering if her husband was John Hicks, who was a major Miccosukee chief. The old woman says that she lived on the warpath, moving from camp to camp with her children after the battle for 7 years, following the fortunes of Osceola, Billy Bowlegs, and other famous chiefs. Her old eyes fairly glittered with rage, and she climbed clenched her bony fingers when she described the conference and the treachery of Colonel Jessup, who induced Osceola to attend the meeting under a flag of truce, solemnly uh, plighting his honor for the safety of the distinguished foe. Osceola was no sooner surrounded by the Americans than he was arrested. The haughty warrior rebuked General Jessup for his perfidy and then presented his naked neck, telling him to cut it and see the blood of a brave man. So that I think that's Osceola saying, go ahead and cut my neck and I'll show you the blood of a brave man. The Seminoles were soon found another leader and counted the war in defense of their country. Excuse me a minute, this type print's pretty small here. The American soldiers had found a foe men worthy of their steel, and many generals whose names had commanded victory on other fields suffered defeat in the swamps of Florida before General Worth's bloodhounds tore the flesh from the bones of the last defiant Seminole. Sorry, this real faint print here, but this is very, very good. No Negroes were scalped, says Aunt Betsy with fury. No, not bless you, your life, honey. That means Indians they brought with them from the plains in flight. Us knew well enough that every Negro was worth a handful of gold. Interesting in this old woman, uh, one cannot avoid the conclusion that the Negroes cut the big figure in that terrible war. When Chief Billy Bowlegs was captured in 1842, actually, he surrendered in 1848. Aunt Betsy gathered her children about her and went with her people under a guard of soldiers towards the setting sun. The government settled the remnant of Seminoles who had arrived the long war on a reservation in Indian Territory. Aunt Betsy's sons enlisted in the United States Army, and in order to be near them, she lived for more than half a century among the western forts. A few Seminoles are living on the tract of land near Fort Clark. As to just how they came to be there is one of the next page affairs of the government that is past finding out. Uh, that's another story. There are several old Negroes and many old Indians among these people. Aunt Betsy says that they have been there a long time and that they own the land. They dwell in comfortable cabins and cultivate small fields and gardens, selling much of their produce to the soldiers at Fort Clark. All of the old Indians support Aunt Betsy in her opinion as to her great age. They held her in the highest esteem as the authority in matters connected with the history of the tribe. Her eyesight is dim, otherwise, she is a well preserved woman. Someone having suggested that the old women deserved a pension, she quickly replied that there are many people more in need of government assistance. Her boys, she said, kept her well supplied with everything she desired. And that is a very neat newspaper article with some great historical quotes, if they're true. And I probably think they are. And one more thing, there's a website. It's the Seminole Indian Negro Scout, uh, Seminole Indian Negro Scout Cemetery Association. The webpage, I'll have it in the notes. This is it right here. Um, they had a family reunion every year in Brackettsville, Texas. I haven't heard of it recently. So I don't know if it stopped since the pandemic, but they have a place, Medal of Honor recipients, some that are buried. There's Adam Payne and Isaac Payne, who are no doubt even different spelling. They're Medal of Honor winners, but they're probably related to her. Pompey Factor and John Ward, other Medal of Honor recipients. And of the hard history, Adam Payne he was one of the cavalry soldiers and was the lieutenant of the company, or actually, I think his captain took three of the scouts. The Comanches had stolen their horses, so the captain and three of the scouts went to get him back and fought and got him back. And the three scouts that was with him, I think Pompey Factor was the other one. Uh, all three of them were awarded the Medal of Honor for what they did. They were outnumbered 10 to 1 and got the horses back. I think one of the Paynes had their horse shot out from under him. Sadly, Adam Payne, he was killed in a gunfight with the town sheriff at the time. They kind of fell in in disfavor because of some of the racism. Some of them quit the army and ran down to Mexico um, and came back again. But Adam Payne, the sheriff that he was killed by was another Medal of Honor recipient. So you have the only time in history one Medal of Honor recipient was killed by another Medal of Honor recipient. So it's a very sad history. I'm not going to get into all of it here, but just want to make you aware. And I have some more history coming up this month. Talk to you later.